Hello and welcome to this webinar on the latest functionality contained within the new version of STRUMIS Evolution, version 10.4. In this webinar, we're going to take a look at progress billing and some of the enhancements we've made through processes such as variations on my contract. If you have any questions throughout the course of this webinar, please post them in the chat window and we will be evaluating those at the end. To begin with, I'm going to go up to my contract contained within my ribbon. And as you can see, this is an existing job. There's already plenty of data in there for me to work with. So within the contract, we'll see that we've made some significant enhancements on the Invoicing tab. Now, unlike the previous versions of the software, we can see we have these 4 new boxes across the top that are going to show us information and data pertinent to the information we contain within our milestones, along with other processes such as invoicing and of course the way that we handle our retention, which again is completely new in 10.4. First process I'm going to go through here is to add our milestones to our grid. Now, of course, I can go through and manually add these as I've always been able to do. Of course, now we have the new functionality of going down to actions and adding our milestones either from our QS categories or from our estimate subsections. If I click on that, it's going to then show me the subsections that are available from the chosen estimate. Now, of course, I can come up here and choose a different estimate if I wish. It's simply defaulting to the estimate connected up here on my contract ribbon. And I can choose any of the categories I like and modify the values if needed. So I'm just going to grab everything that I have there and hit add. Now you may have noticed that by doing that, I've now got values kicking in through on my contract totals. I could also come in here and any of my 0 values, I could modify those. So let's just put in a number for bolts. And when I tab out of this, keep an eye on the values. You can see there that they've reacted to the change that's occurred in the grid below. Now let's draw our attention to the retention or retainage section. And I'm going to put in a percentage for the default. Now this is the default retention or retainage that we're going to be using for any of the applications for payments that we make through this process, which of course could be modified on an application by application basis. Of course, I also need to apply my due date, my retention, which I'm going to put as approximately a year from my completion date. So I'm going to just work my way out to 2021, August, and let's make it a year. Let's put it 30th. So with that in place, I can now save this contract and the invoicing tab. And now that we have some values in place, and we have our retention values in and my retention due date, I'd like to point out that if we go to the contract search grid, we now have some new columns available to us to see these values in motion against each of our contracts. And as usual, we have the option to filter by and sort the data. So we can see the information starting to bleed through into this search grid. It's just going to make it much easier for us to see where we've actually claimed against certain contracts and where we have outstanding values that need to be taken into consideration. So let's go back to our invoicing tab and look at the next function. So if I go back to actions, now that I've saved it, I can now go to create application for payment for milestones. So I'm going to utilize my first section, my heavy beams. I'm going to go to actions, create application for payment from milestone. And you can see there that it's dragged it through into this new form, our application for payment. And the first thing I'm going to do is set my application due date and save the record. So now that we have our application for payment form open, it may be that we want to add further milestones to this. Maybe I want to add more than just my heavy beams. I could go down to actions in the bottom corner and add milestones from contract. From here, it's going to show me all of them that I haven't added yet. And from here, I could select a number of these, or in this case, I'm just going to choose all of them. There we are, they've now populated into my application for payment. So the next step is maybe we want to take a look at some of the figures in this application. It might be that I want to modify the percentage complete. It might be I'm not applying for the entire 100% completion of each of these individual milestones. So let's say I could come in here, I can manually type in here, let's say I'm only applying for 25% of my heavy beams, and maybe let's do 50% of my medium beams. Of course, if I want to apply a variable figure to more than one record in here, I could grab a number of these and come down here to Actions, and I can use the batch update to affect a change to the percentage, and let's say 25% across the board for those milestones. As you can see, the value for this period also modifies as a result of a modification of the percentage. Now I could come in here and manually override the value. So let's make that 700. And that has a direct impact upon the percentage complete. These two fields are bound together. So like I say, if I wish to use a value modification for multiple records, again, I could select a number of lines in here, go down to the Actions button and hit Batch Update. And this time, rather than doing it on a percentage, I could modify using value. So perhaps I put in 800 for each of those, and you can see there again, it modifies the percentage complete as a result of that. I'm just going to put that back to my 25% using my batch update. There we are. Now it might be that I also wish to claim for a value or percentage of my materials stored, as well as the percentage complete. So again, I could manually modify this within the grid and suggest maybe I want to claim for 20% of my materials stored value, or I could simply overtype materials stored. And again, if I want to, I have the option to utilize the batch update to modify that either by value again or by percentage, and that will affect the relative field as we saw in the same way that we had with the percentage complete and the value for this period. So pop in there 20%. You can see that the value changes, and this of course will affect then the retention values. And as I mentioned previously, you can see that 5% is being dragged through as the default retention percentage, as we saw from the contract invoicing tab. We have 5% set as default retention. And of course, if we want to, we can modify that to any number that we wish with a manual overtype. And of course, as before, we also have the opportunity to use the batch update to change the retention, either by value or by percentage for each of my affected lines. So far through this process, we've looked at adding the values in against our contract milestones added into this application for payment. However, we also have the added functionality of being able to add the value directly in from variations as well. And that can be done by looking at our variations tab up here. And if I go down to Actions and add variation from this contract, it's going to load me up any of the approved variations that I have associated with my contract, where I can select them and simply add them in. Now, before I do that, I'm just going to go back to my contract and we're going to have a look at some of the new functionality we have surrounding variations. So I'm going to go back to my contract. I'm going to go onto my variations tab. And we can see here that we have these two new boxes at the top that are actively drawing the data from the contract value, as well as showing me the total for any of my approved variations and giving me the grand total of that at the bottom here. And to the right hand side, we have the invoicing values that when I do actually create an invoice against one of these variations, it will then add in the values for that as well. And unlike the previous versions of the software where we had the Add Client Change Order button down here, we can now add variations and create variations directly from inside the contract itself, and this will list them all out in this grid here as well. So to do that, I would just have to go to Actions and Create Variation, and that's going to create me up a new variation screen. Like this. Now I'm actually going to open up one of my existing variations, as I already have some data in there. And again, the layout here has changed and there's some new functionality included as well. We now have got the option for adding child variations directly inside of this screen. So all we would have to do is specify a variation as a parent, and then we would be able to use the button down here to create child variations. Now this one in particular happens to be a child variation. You can see there that this is already connected, and we've also moved the variation total option down to the bottom here. It used to be up here. Obviously ticking that box means that any values that we have on the valuation tab will then be utilized for this particular variation. Now to the right hand side, the state of this particular variation is set to approved. We've already gone through all of the stages listed to get it down to approved, which means it's now available to be picked up for the application for payment. And I'd just like to point out on the right hand side here, the individuals populated in this list by using the drop down menu are actually pulled from the contract contact tab, both internal and external contacts, to greatly reduce the selection process when you're going through this this process. So it pays to add those people into that tab to reduce down the workflow here. So if I take a look through what else we have in this variation, we've got the impact pane here, where we can obviously specify the direct impact through various different headings, and we can tick the box to the side and add detail for each of these record types. Now, this information, we'll see this come through on our reporting functionality in a little bit, and we have some new reports surrounding variations as well. We'll have a look at those a little later on. And in the valuations tab, you can see that I've pulled in my values, my cost codes here, against one of my estimates. So I've used an estimate to create the value required against this variation with my steel lists and supporting further costings, and brought those cost codes in. Now, of course, now I have the option here using line description where I can actually name what each of these cost codes are connected to and what they're referencing. So I can name these anything I like. And we now have the option, as well as doing that, to add negative value if we were doing something along the lines of crediting a customer back. So I could put in perhaps cold rolled in there and then specify a negative value. Let's just put in -5. There we are. Not going to use that line. I already have it built. So moving forward, we've got our correspondence tab in here now, where we can add in supporting documentation against this variation, as well as RFIs and emails. So if I was to add, let's say, an RFI into here, I could go new to create a new RFI for this, and then it opens up the RFI wizard where I could just follow it through. If I would have a package created, I could use a package for this, or I could use the RFI generation wizard to create a new one. And of course, once completed, that lists in here. And on the emails tab, I can drag and drop my emails directly into here as well, as we have in other areas of the system. Now the key requirements tab is brand new to variations as well, and there's an interesting new option that we have available in here, and it's something that we can see mirrored back through the contract as well. And basically what we can do is use the copy option down here to copy the data that's in the requirements, the key requirements section, which again is new on the contract. So just taking a step back, let's have a look at where that is. So you can see here, there's the contract again, and we can see our key requirements tab here. And we can see that these have been populated, and these were populated by using copy and copy from inquiry. So again, taking a step further back again, back to the very start of this job, when I built the inquiry, I had the opportunity in the key requirements tab to add the data in here, either using my drop-down options for existing menu options or using my ellipsis to build new ones. I've populated this form here, which, as I say, I've then gone into the contract and I've copied the data from the inquiry into the contract key requirements section. And then inside my variation, I've then taken that data from the contract itself. So now that we've seen some of the new functionality surrounding variations, I just want to finish this section off by taking a look at some of the new reports we have available to us. Now I've taken the liberty of pinning these to my reports to make it a bit quicker on the access. So go to Contracts Management. We can see here the 4 new reports we're going to be looking at. So we've got List of Variations, that's the one we're going to run first. We've also got a Client and Internal Notification and a Request Report. So I'm going to start off with List of Variations. And I'm going to run this against my contract customer, so STRUMIS. And you can see here I've got a contract limiter if I need it. Below that I have a status option where I can select a limiter to say only show me variations of a certain status, and then a couple of options at the bottom to either include closed variations or not, and a summary option. Now I'm going to run this in full to get as much detail as I can out of this report. I'm going to go to Run Report, and then it should load in my report preview above. And we can see here that it's grouping the data first by contract, then by the state, and then showing me all the variations within that specific contract against that state. And then we've got the weight, hours, and value fields coming through as well. Now, if I look to my example at the bottom down here, we can see the 2 child variations I have in place against my most recent contract. That's the one we're looking at the moment. And then below that here, we have the parent variation. And if we look at the values, we can see that the values for both child variations add up to the parent. So the next report I want to run, I'm going to start off by going to the Impact tab. This is going to play a part in our next report, in our request report. So if I run that, this report is quite interesting in the way that it handles, let's run it for that one, it handles the data from the impact screen, because it limits down on the impact section on the report only those areas that we've included. So we only had schedule, fabrication, material treatment, drawing office, and subcontractor ticked on the variation with data contained within it. And of course, this is then going to show me the valuation section as well, with the values for each of the entries inside my variation. Okay. So I'm going to close this variation down and return to my application for payment to continue the workflow, where I will add this variation directly into my application. And as we can see, it's added that in now. It's still in the applied for section, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And at the bottom down here, you can see the variation totals have now been added in. So I'm just going to save that. And before we progress any further, I'd just like to point out that we have a correspondence tab here as well within the application where we can add in supporting documentation or RFIs or emails. In this case, I'm just going to add an RFI to this. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to click Add with the RFI tab highlighted, and that's going to generate me a search of any of the RFIs I have connected to my contract. I'm going to grab that one and hit Add, close, and that's now added that RFI into this application. Of course, there is an opportunity here to do drag and drop for documents, or there's always this option for new here as well, where we can click on new, and it gives us the opportunity to create either a new document. For document management, we can go to RFIs and launch the RFI wizard from hitting new. And as I say, we've got emails in there as well that we can drag and drop in. So let's go back to the details tab and continue this process of pushing the application through. And next thing we need to do is look at what we need to do to approve the values that we have in place. So at the moment you can see the status is set for preparation, and the aim here is to get the values from applied for to agreed as per the approval of the client. So we need to take a look here at the statuses. Now I can set that to submitted for submitted to client. That's then going to place the values into the agreed tab, and from here, if I save this, we may be in a scenario whereby the customer has come back and has disputed the values that we've submitted to them. So it may be that perhaps we need to change some of the values here. So maybe percentage complete needs to be dropped down, let's say to 20%, or I might need to change my materials stored down a little bit. Let's take that to 15%. So I can go through the same process I did in the applied for tab, where I modified the values, but we're at a stage now where we can put the client's responded values in against this application. And again, as we had previously, I still have the option to use the batch update for multiple values as I need to. So once we've gotten to a state where we have the values in a position where the client has agreed on them, we can then set it to approved by client. Now, once we're in this state, we're now in a position to be able to go to actions, and we can now create an invoice for this application. So as we can see with the sales invoice generated, it's creating me the record up here, and we can see that invoice to date values are now starting to appear on the agreed tab. If I go to the sales invoice itself, we now have this progress billing heading here, and we can see the entries that have come from our application for payment listed, as well as the individual entity here for our variation. So if I then go back to details, and as per the usual workflow, approve it, that's now at a state of completion. I'll set it to closed. If I then go back to my contract and go to my invoicing tab, I can see that I now have information coming through on my invoicing totals. And if I go off and have a look at my contract search grid, I should now have against my contract my invoicing totals coming through here as well. So let's go back to our contract at this point, and we're going to look at the last couple of functions I want to go through in this grid here. So we can see that we've got some material stored values against our, let's use this medium beams here as the example, and we have an option to release our materials stored upon the point when we can do that, given the scenario that the client has now sent the money for that has already been placed onto the invoice. And what I can do is I can modify my value to release for that particular line. Let's say that we've now released £1,000 worth. And if I hit OK, it's going to reduce that value over here in materials stored by £1,000, and it's going to move that over to the already invoiced section, which means I've simply got £1,204 worth of stored materials yet to be released. I also have the option here to claim my retention, which I'm going to do throughout the remainder. And I'm going to go to select everything, go to claim retention. So now I have opened our new invoice up at the top here. And if I go to my lines, the remaining retention values have now been incorporated into that. And again, I can go through the process of approving it. And at this point, I could then generate my invoice report to claim the remainder of my retention. So at this point, let's go back and recap our workflow. So the starting point we're going to be going through is adding our milestones to our contract invoicing tab. And we'll be doing that by either manually adding those, bringing them in from an estimate or from a QS analysis. So first step is going to be, I'm just going to clear out all these tabs, open up my other contract, and we're going to go to the contract itself. Go to the invoicing tab. And as I say, I could manually add in milestones into here, but I'm going to go down here, go to actions. I'm going to add milestones from my estimate. Add those in. And of course, we can do things like modify the values or do a combination and add some more milestones into here manually. And of course, we've still got the QS if we wish to use that instead. So that's step one. Step two, we have the opportunity to add variations into the contract. So we can create the variations new. Go down here to actions and create variations. I already have one in place, so I'm going to use that for this process. So the next step is we're going to be adding our milestones and potentially our variation as well onto our application for payment. So I'm going to do that by going back to my invoicing tab, grabbing the items that I want to add. I'm going to add them all onto my application. So now we're going to right click and go to create application for payment from milestones. So with our application created, I'm just going to give it a description and specify my due date. So let's just put it at the end of next month. And now the next step is we can modify the values if we need to. So I could either come in here and tweak the percentages or change the values for a singular line, or as we saw before, I can grab them all, go to actions and batch update. I can modify either the values or I could modify the percentages. So let's just make that 25%. And I could also put in a percentage from material stored or a value. So again, I'm just going to do a percentage. I'll do it at 10%. And batch update. So I've now got some values in here. Now if I need to, I can also then add my variations. Come up to the variations tab. So I can go to actions, add a variation from contract. It shows my variation in there. I can highlight that up and go to add and close that, and that's going to add that in. And again, I could change the percentages for this. It modifies the value, or I can do value or percentage. So with that in place, the next step will be to set it to submitted to client. I'm just going to save that. And that's then going to drop it into this agreed tab. And again, once that's been submitted, we could get the values back from the client, and it might be that we have a variable to the numbers we've submitted. So it might be that they've said we only want to do 15% of that, or it might be that we want to only put in £2,000 of our beams medium, which again modifies our percentage. And then once that's been fully completed and the numbers are fully agreed upon, we can then set that up to go to approved by client, at which point we can then move on to the next step. So when this is approved, we can go to Actions and create Invoice for application. So that then modifies the values here to show invoice to date. Go to our invoice, look at the progress billing tab. We can see the values have been brought through onto it here. And we would do the same thing we would normally do. Approve our invoices and then inevitably close them once submitted and value returned. So of course, once we've done that, and that's the first portion done, we can then return back to our contract. So when you're in a position where you've been progressively invoicing throughout the span of the contract, you'll be in a situation where you may want to claim your materials stored. So for the final step here, before I go to my retention, I'm going to go to Actions, Release Materials Stored. That's going to give me a selection grid where I can choose which of the entries I'd like to take, and I can also go in and modify the values to release. I'm going to take all of it and hit OK. With my materials stored released, I'm now going to go to Actions and I'm going to go through another application for payment. Again, values to modify if required. I'm going to go straight to approved by client without going through the modification stages. And from there, I'm going to go straight to my invoice for the application. And that's going to then create me my final invoice. I'm going to set that to approved, which means it's then exportable to any of our external finance packages. And from there, I can then go back into my contract, select all of my values, go to Actions, and finally claim my retention. The last thing I'd like to point out, up in the top, I have applications for payment now listed on the contract ribbon. If I open that up, I can get at any of my applications for the contract. And of course, as we had before, my sales invoices are also listed up here. Thank you for participating in this 10.4 webinar. For those of you who had questions posted in the chat window, we're now going to do a quick Q&A session with Chris Eaton.